Hi everybody. Welcome to a lecture on specialized plant parts. We'll start off talking about tubers. Tubers are enlarged or swollen underground stems. So these are structures that you will find in the ground, underground. Tubers are true stems, they have nodes, and they have buds. Two examples of plants that make tubers are potatoes and Jerusalem artichokes. So let's take a look at this picture. So most of us would think that a potato is actually some type of modified root, but it's not. A potato is a modified stem. A potato is a tuber. Take a look at the picture on the left. The picture on the left illustrates a young seedling potato. There's a line indicating the ground line. So when the potato seedling germinates and begins to grow, it forms structures called rhizomes above ground. These rhizomes turn and begin growing into the soil. As the potato leaves photosynthesize and convert sunlight into sugar, those sugars are stored in young tubers that develop at the ends of the rhizomes. So these young tubers are developing underground. So even though a potato is a structure that you find underground, it is still a modified stem. Here's a picture of Jerusalem artichoke and Jerusalem artichoke tubers. Another specialized plant part is a tuberous root. So tuberous roots are root modifications. They do not have nodes or buds, although tuberous roots may form adventitious shoots. They are used for food storage in a similar way that a tuber like a potato is used for food storage. Two examples of plants that make tuberous roots are sweet potatoes and dahlias. Now don't confuse tuberous roots with tubers. Tuberous roots are root modifications and tubers are modified stems. So here's a picture of sweet potato. So sweet potato is an example of a tuberous root. If you look at the picture on the right, you can see that sweet potato tuberous root has formed some adventitious shoots. And this is a picture of dahlia. We've seen this picture before earlier in class. So dahlia is another example of a plant that forms tuberous roots. Another specialized plant part that we've already taken a look at in class is something called the fleshy taproot. A fleshy taproot is a taproot that's been modified for food storage. And some examples of plants that we've seen earlier that make fleshy taproots include carrots, sugar beets, turnips, and radishes. So all those plants that I just mentioned are examples of plants that make fleshy taproots. All right, carrots are examples of fleshy taproots. And turnips are another example of fleshy taproots. Now one thing to remember is a plant that makes a fleshy taproot will make one taproot per plant. Plants that make tuberous roots will have a cluster or a clump of tuberous roots per plant. Sugar beets are fleshy taproots. Beets are another example of fleshy taproots. And of course, radishes as well. Another specialized plant part is called the spur. Spurs are short, slow-growing stems that bear leaves, flowers, or fruit, and you do not find spurs on all species of plants. If you look at this picture, this is a picture of crabapple, and you can see clusters of these kind of yellowish green crab apples kind of hanging from these interesting little red stems, and those little red stems are connected to the spur. So those little short modified stems that you see the fruit hanging from, those are the spurs that we're talking about. A rhizome is also a stem modification. Rhizomes are generally going to be found underground, so think of rhizomes as being underground stems. They usually grow horizontally, so that is to say they grow parallel to the surface of the soil, more or less. And rhizomes are capable of producing new shoots and new roots. So what you see in the picture on the right is an iris rhizome. So the kind of the horizontal thickened portion that you see in the picture, that is the actual rhizome. And you can see developing from that rhizomes we have new leaves, and we also have new roots. So rhizomes have the ability to make new shoots with leaves and new roots. All right, this picture shows quackgrass. Quackgrass is considered a weed in people's lawns. It is a plant that produces rhizomes, and its rhizomes are very long and thin. So in the picture that you see in the upper left, you can see, a long thin rhizome and then several quackgrass shoots with roots developing along that rhizome. So rhizomes are going to help a plant like quackgrass spread out and take over a larger area in your lawn. That's why quackgrass is such a difficult weed to control, is because it's spreading by these rhizomes. And then if you look at the picture on the bottom right, you're just looking at a close-up of those rhizomes, and you can see the individual quackgrass shoots kind of developing from that rhizome. So plants use rhizomes to spread and take over a larger area, and rhizomes can make it difficult to kill a plant. Stolons are another type of stem modification. So what makes a stolon different from a rhizome is that a stolon is generally going to be an above ground stem. So stolons are above ground stems that kind of run across the soil surface. In fact, another name that's often used to describe a stolon is a runner. So if you look at the picture on the right, you're looking at strawberry plants, and you can see these stolons or runners kind of stretching across the soil surface. And whenever that stolon kind of bends over and touches the soil, another shoot and roots are formed. So stolons are also horizontally growing in the same way that a rhizome is horizontally growing. And a stolon has the ability to produce new shoots and new roots. So again, a stolon is a type of plant modification that allows a plant to spread out and take over a greater area. Okay, this is a picture of a plant called bugleweed. The genus of this plant is Ajuga, and bugleweed would be considered a ground cover, so something that we would plant in our landscape to kind of cover an area or fill in an area. And what makes bugleweed such a great ground cover is the fact that it can spread by these stolons that it produces that you can see in the picture. All right, a corm is probably something that most of you are not familiar with. A corm is also a stem modification. So by definition, corms are compressed, swollen, vertical stems. You find corms underground, so they're going to be located underground in the soil. They have a papery covering. So take a look at the crocus corms that you see pictured in the upper right. Each individual corm is covered with that brown paper-like covering. As I just mentioned, you find corms underground, and two examples of plants that make corms are crocus and gladiolus plants. Alright, so let's look at this picture. This shows the development of a corm over time. Now, depending on the species of plant that you're propagating by corms, the corms could be planted in the fall or they could be planted in the spring. It just depends on the species of plant. So in this example, let's pretend that we planted this corm in the fall. And now it's April. So the corm is there, sitting there in the soil. Not much is happening. The corm is waiting for the soil temperatures to get warmer. And when that happens in May, late April into May, that corm is going to begin to grow. So the corm is going to start to form a shoot, and that shoot is going to grow above ground. It will produce leaves. Those leaves are going to photosynthesize, and they're going to produce sugars. Those sugars are going to be translocated through the stem, and they're going to end up in a new corm. So a new corm starts to develop on top of the old original corm that you planted last fall. And that new corm is forming because it is storing all those sugars that the leaves are making during photosynthesis. And then finally by August, the old corm that you planted in the fall has kind of shriveled up. The new corm has developed on top of it, and now it is fully formed. And then there's some interesting little structures that develop between the old and the new corm. These are called cormels. Think of a cormel as sort of being a baby corm. Here's some pictures of a plant called gladiolus that I took several years ago. So if we start with the picture on the left, I planted a gladiolus corm in the spring because gladiolus is a corm that you would normally plant during the spring season. So I let that corm develop for a couple of weeks, and then I dug it up. So what you're looking at in the far left picture is the spring planted corm, and you can see that it has developed a shoot. The tip of that shoot is starting to green up, so that's where the shoot punctured through the soil surface and was exposed to sunlight. And then at the bottom of the corm you also see some roots that are starting to develop. Alright, in the picture that you see in the middle, I chose a different corm to harvest, and I dug it up several weeks after I dug up the first corm. So in that picture you see a more fully developed shoot. It's green, it has produced leaves. You can see the corm, and you can see the roots that are developing from the bottom of the corm. And then finally in the picture on the right, you see the original corm that I planted, and then on top of that original corm you see like a little swollen bump. Okay, that represents the new corm that is starting to form on top of the old corm. And as we discussed earlier, that's happening because those leaves are photosynthesizing. Those sugars are being stored in that new corm as it forms on top of the old one. And the old corm will eventually disintegrate as time goes on. Bulbs. Bulbs are very interesting structures. Most people would probably consider bulbs to be stem modifications, but really what a bulb is a miniaturized plant that contains stem tissue, leaves, an apical bud, and has the ability to produce shoots and roots. And all this is packaged and compartmentalized in a compact structure that you would find underground. Bulbs come in two different kinds. The first type is the tunicate bulb. Tunicate bulbs have a papery outer covering, and an onion is an example of a plant that produces a tunicate bulb. Tulips and daffodils are other examples of plants that produce tunicate bulbs. Scaly bulbs are different in that they lack a papery outer covering, and lilies are examples of plants that produce scaly bulbs. This picture shows a tunicate bulb, and let's go ahead and identify the various parts of this tunicate bulb. So if we start at the bottom of the bulb, there's a structure called the basal plate. The basal plate is actually a modified stem, and then connected to that basal plate is an apical bud. So that's a bud. It sits right on top of the basal plate, and that bud will eventually form a shoot that will bear leaves and flowers. Another structure that you see in a tunicate bulb are the scales of the bulb, and the scales are actually modified leaves. The scales of a bulb are the structures that store the carbohydrates. And then of course, wrapping this or surrounding this tunicate bulb is a brown papery covering that we call a tunic. This picture shows the life cycle of a bulb, and this picture would work for both tunicate and scaly bulbs. So if you look at this picture, again, most bulbs that you and I are familiar with would be fall planted. So if we look at the far left hand side of the picture where it says number 1, imagine that this is a bulb that was fall planted. Doesn't matter whether it's tunicate or scaly. We planted it in the fall. And then as we kind of crank the clock forward from fall through winter into spring, you can see the thermometer. Temperatures are starting to warm up, and specifically it's the soil temperatures that we're concerned about. As those soil temperatures warm up in late March into early April, that bulb is going to start to become active and it's going to start to grow. So you can see some roots developing in number 2 and number 3. And then by picture number 4, you can see that we're starting to push out a new shoot. And that shoot develops from that apical bud that we spoke of earlier. And then by number 5, you can see that that shoot has produced leaves and eventually a tulip flower. And then by number 6, as the temperatures begin to warm, air temperatures continue to warm, that bulb, or that new shoot rather, is going to start to die back. And that's going to happen probably in late June, July into August. But that's not going to happen before the plant forms specialized structures called bulblets, which you see in number 6. So bulblets are somewhat akin to the cormels that we spoke of earlier. Bulblets are baby bulbs, small little bulbs that form kind of on the sides of the original bulb. So before the plant dies back, it wants to make sure that it can reproduce again, and its manner of reproduction in the future is going to be through those bulblets. So by picture number 7, the entire plant has pretty much disintegrated, and what we're left with are several bulblets. People also refer to those as offset bulbs, and you can see that they formed from the basal plate of the original bulb that you planted in the fall. All right, moving on to a crown. A crown is a structure that really has 2 definitions depending upon whether you're a horticulturalist or whether you're a forester. So from a horticultural perspective, a crown is the part of a plant stem that is near or at the soil surface. From a forestry perspective, the crown of the plant is the top of the tree where the branches are located. So here's a picture of some hosta plants. Hostas are herbaceous perennial plants, And these are what are called hosta crown divisions. So somebody dug a hosta plant up in the fall and divided it into two plants. And where you see the black arrow, that black arrow points to the crown of the hosta plant. So in other words, it's pointing to the interface between the shoot system and the root system that would exist at or just below the soil surface. This represents the forestry definition of a crown. So we're looking at a tree, and the crown is the area that's identified by the parentheses that you see on the right. So in this picture, the crown consists of all the branches bearing leaves that that tree produces. A sucker is an adventitious shoot that arises from the root system of a plant. So suckers develop from the root systems of plants. And this is a great picture of a contorted filbert plant. And it shows numerous suckers that you can see developing from the root system. Contorted filbert is usually propagated by grafting, and it is notorious for producing prolific, vigorous suckers from the rootstock that are straight as an arrow. Note that these suckers arise from the ground rather than from the grafted trunk, and they should be removed as soon as possible to keep them from eventually taking over the plant. So contorted filbert is supposed to have twisted, contorted stems, but these suckers that develop from the root system are a different genotype. So they are straight. They are not twisted or contorted, and you need to remove those. You need to prune those out. Otherwise, they will eventually take over the plant and kind of destroy the look of the contorted filbert plant. Another specialized plant structure is called the water sprout. Water sprouts are shoots that arise from stem tissue, specifically from latent buds that are found just underneath the bark of certain plants. And water sprouts generally form in response to pruning. So if a tree has been excessively pruned, if a lot of material has been removed from the tree or shrub, then the tree or shrub is going to respond by producing water sprouts. And the tree is just thinking, wow, I've lost a lot of my photosynthetic ability. I've just been pruned very hard. So I'm going to try to kind of make up for that severe pruning by producing these water sprouts that are going to develop from my trunk. So trees that are heavily pruned tend to develop a lot of water sprouts. Now, the unfortunate thing about water sprouts is they are not strongly connected to the stem. So if a tree develops a branch on its own, and if that branch has a nice wide angle, that's going to be a very strong point of attachment to the trunk of a tree. However, water sprouts do not have a very strong attachment to the trunk of the tree, and therefore they tend to kind of break during severe windstorms or under snow loads, things like that. Tendrils are stem or leaf modifications that are used to support plants as they climb. So in this picture you see up in the top the red vine weed tendrils that coil and latch onto structures for support. And then in the pictures on the bottom you see a plant called Boston ivy. Boston ivy produces tendrils that help it climb up the sides of buildings. And the tendrils that a Boston ivy produces actually have little suction cups on the end of the tendrils. You can kind of see those in the picture on the left, sort of near the top right hand portion of that picture. You see those kind of cup-like structures that are grabbing onto the cement there, helping that Boston ivy plant climb. And then in the picture on the right, well, if you've ever been to an older part of town in an area of the United States where Boston ivy grows, you may end up seeing something like this. So this is a Boston ivy vine kind of growing up the side of an older brick building. Thorns, spines, or prickles. These are three additional structures that some plants produce. So thorns are modified stems. Spines are modified leaves. And prickles develop from the epidermis of certain plants. All right, so you're looking at a picture of honey locust, and this is the species, Gleditsia triacanthos. And honey locusts are an example of a plant that produce true thorns. Most of us don't want honey locust plants in our yards because those thorns represent a liability. So most of us would prefer the thornless variety of honey locust, which would be Gleditsia triacanthos variety inermis. These are pictures of cactus spines. So those spines are actually the modified leaves of the cactus plant. So cacti have spines. The spines don't really contribute a lot to photosynthetic production. Most of the photosynthesis that cacti do is going to be in their stem tissue. So the stem tissue of cactus plants, those cells contain chloroplasts, and those cells are able to photosynthesize. The leaves on cacti have developed into spines, which is in this case a leaf modification. So we had talked earlier about plants called succulents. So these are plants that have the ability to store water in their leaves or stems. And that barrel cactus that you see pictured on the right is a great example of a plant that is a succulent. This is another example of succulent plants. These are actually succulents that people could use in a green roof. If you've heard of green roofs, they were a fad several years ago, and a lot of the plants of choice that people use as green roofs are going to be succulents. And they grow these succulents in small containers that are placed in large trays on the roofs of buildings. And finally, in this picture, you're looking at blackberry prickles. So those prickles that you see on the stem of the blackberry plants, those prickles develop from the epidermis. So really, each prickle that you see is one modified epidermal cell on the blackberry stem. All right, well, that's all I have for you guys. Thank you for watching Specialized Plant Parts.